Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell, and I'm pleased to introduce our guest today, Angie Abdou, well known in the book business and book publishing industry here in the Kootenays. Angie, you've got a new book out. What's the name?
It's called In Case I Go.
Okay, so we're going to talk about that in a few moments, but congratulations. What is this, your fifth book?
Fifth book. It's my fourth novel, and I had one short story collection before that, so number 5.
Well, I have to say my wife says that your short story book is one of her favorites, and she just loves those short stories.
Oh, that's nice. That was my teach myself how to write project. I decided I was going to be a fiction writer, and I bought all the books I could find on fiction writing and just set out one story at a time to kind of figure it out. So I always like when people remember that book.
Good.
It's 11 years old.
Yes, yeah, it's still pertinent. So I want to ask you, Angie, I've interviewed probably a dozen or more Kootenay-based authors here over the series in Talking Kootenay Books, and I can't tell you how many people have mentioned the fact that you've either inspired them or mentored them in some way, had some sort of positive influence on their writing ability or style. How does that make you feel?
Wonderful. Yeah, I really, when I have a student, for example, I taught quite a few people through College of the Rockies, and some of them have gone on to publish books. And when I have a student who gets a publishing contract, it's almost more exciting to me than my own. Like at this stage, I expect that if I write a book, somebody will publish it. Right. But when a student gets that first publishing contract, it's very exciting. Right. I'm especially excited about Dave Butler's new Jenny Wilson series, which is going to be a whole murder mystery series with Dundurn. That's thrilling. I'm very happy for him.
Exciting. We interviewed Dave recently. And so what is it that you are able to pass on or help inspiring authors with?
I start out with a reality check. Like, as you know, it's not all fame and fortune, the writing life. So I make sure people are doing it for the right reasons. I say if you're hoping to get rich, you might want to take up a trade or something. If you're hoping to get famous, I don't know, YouTube channel. I don't even know how people get famous. But if you're doing it because you love story and you love writing and you love the process, then you're doing it for the right reasons. And that's part of why I'm so excited for Dave Butler, because when I met him, I could tell he has he's been successful in other fields. So I know he's capable of hard work, and he knows what hard work means. And he wanted that. He suddenly wanted really badly this book thing. So to see him take those skills he learned in other professions and apply it to the book, and then I can help people, you know, with momentum and characterization and how to make pretty sentences and that kind of thing. But they have to want it for the right reasons and know what the rewards will or will not be.
Right. So you're pretty realistic when you go into that process and really help them appreciate that it's maybe a lot more hard work than they imagine?
I try to be, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's just go back to one of your previous books, and of course that was The Bone Cage. And you had a tremendous run with CBC on that. Just describe that experience a little bit if you could.
Yeah, that book is done. It's a little book that could, right? It's a book about wrestling and swimming, two sports that people don't really care about that much. It's set in Calgary, a city people don't care about that much in the wider scheme of things. And it's published with a little publisher in Edmonton called New West Press. And it kind of just bit by bit got people's attention. So the first good thing that happened to it was the One Book, One Kootenay. The first time the East Kootenay Library Federation, or not the whole Kootenay Library Federation had that. And so One Book, One Kootenay, I went to 16 libraries in the Kootenays, traveled with it with my baby on my hip and my toddler on my hand and my mom helping me in the minivan, like 16 libraries. But it was the first time people really, you know, were there. They thought this book was saying something interesting about sport and about the relationship with the human body and about aging and about what success is. And so that was a nice boost. And then Canada Reads, it was the 10th anniversary edition, and The Bone Cage got onto that. And that was huge exposure for me, living in the Kootenays at that time. And suddenly people in Toronto had heard my name and were reading my book, and I'd go into bookstores and it would be everywhere. And, you know, I was on the national radio, and Georges Laraque, the NHL tough guy, defended my book. He was the celebrity champion for the book in the book debates. And that was just really great exposure. And since then, CBC, the national CBC, has had me on for all my novels on the next chapter, and as well as provincial shows. So it was a huge break to get that kind of exposure. This
show's called Talking Kootenay Books. Is there such a thing as a Kootenay author? What's your impression of that?
That's a good question. I think I'm a Kootenay author in the sense that I explore themes relevant to the Kootenays, but then it's that whole question about local and universal, right? If I'm addressing things that only matter to the Kootenays, I'm not going to have a very big readership, and that doesn't interest me. And so you try to get really specific into the local and thereby reach universal themes. And so I would hope Kootenay readers think of me as a Kootenay writer, because I have set books in fictional Kootenay towns and with the concerns that matter to us very much in this region. But I hope that also extends beyond the Kootenays.
Right. So
And I think that's true if I think of, Anne DeGrace from Nelson, or David Butler from Cranbrook.
So that strong sense of place can, though, appeal to a larger and wider audience as well, right?
Yeah, well, you think of all the great writers that have come out of Newfoundland setting their books there, and it's not just Newfoundland readers that like them. That strong, really grounded narrative can be more engaging to people who live there as well as don't. Yeah.
Right. So you're in the process of launching your new book. In fact, it's been launched. Let's talk about In Case I Go. I understand there's a real Ktunaxa connection to the book and so forth. Do you just want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, can I back up? Because I didn't start, this book has been in the Quill Enquirer, the biggest book industry magazine in the country, called it a truth and reconciliation book. And I think that's a fair description. But I would have never started by setting out to write a truth and reconciliation book. That's such a big, frightening, gigantic topic. I just wouldn't take it on. And I wouldn't have set out in the same way to write about Ktunaxa, because who am I to write about Ktunaxa? So I'll just back up to where I did start, and we can work our way to that. But I wanted to write something fun and light. Didn't go that way. I was reading a lot of Andrew Piper, and he's like Canada's Stephen King. He writes really wonderful horrors. And I was back to that, I remember being 14 and under the covers with my flashlight reading Stephen King far past when I should have been sleeping. And I had that feeling with Andrew Piper, that love of reading just for fun again. And I thought, I want to kind of try something like that. And in Fernie, I don't know if you know, the graveyard is fenced off, of course, and it's right near Ridgemont, or it's in Ridgemont, this neighborhood. And there are human remains all through Ridgemont. Did you know that?
I didn't, no.
Yeah, so sometimes people will be making a driveway and they'll just find a femur. There's just human remains around. And this one big field where there used to be a school, when they built the school, they found quite a lot of human remains. It's right across from the graveyard, and the building got shut down because of the bones. So the next time they ran into human remains, they just thought, let's not tell anyone because we don't want to lose a day pay. So they shoved them all to the one far end and built the school. The school has since been torn down, and it's very desirable property, and so big, beautiful mountain homes are being built there. There's human remains. So two of the lots have been, you can't build on them because they did an ultrasound test, and it looks like there's about 48 human bodies on the two lots. And so I just started thinking, and if you're around Ridgemont, you'll see there'll just be little gravestones somewhere, random places, or in that big lot, there's a group of 3 gravestones fenced off separately from the graveyard. And if you live there all the time, you're just like, oh yeah, there's gravestones around. It's kind of, it's just, when you're right in the weirdness, you sometimes forget how weird it is. And so I started thinking, wouldn't that be a great setting for a horror novel? So I started writing, I was just going to write a flat out horror, scary ghost story with this setting. And it wasn't going well at all. It was, I had an outline, and I had this idea that I was going to control the process, and it was going to be an easy book, and I was going to write along according to this outline, and just wasn't coming to life for me, and I wasn't enjoying it, and I was thinking, I don't even want to write anymore. I hate this. Those kind of things that you have. And then I went in March 2015 to a Writers Guild conference. I was speaking there. Christian Book, a poet from University of Calgary, was speaking, and Michael Helm, a novelist from York University, was speaking. And when Michael Helm started talking, he started talking about writing into the dark and not trying to control the process. And by letting yourself follow that mysterious process, you access part of your brain that you would never otherwise access. And talk about writing almost like it was a spiritual sort of act. And the way he talked about it in those terms reminded me what I used to like about writing. And I got really excited about it. And the more I heard him talk like that, the more I just wanted to leave and go home and work on this novel. So it took a real turn at that point. And it became not a ghost story, but a book about the ways we're haunted. And so the ways we have to live out our ancestors' mistakes. And so the biggest mistakes in this country, of course, are the treatment of the Indigenous people, the genocide. And then, on the other hand, the mistreatment of the environment. So that's where the Ktunaxa came into it. So I just wrote the whole book, writing into the dark and not really knowing what I was doing. And then when I was finished, I thought, here I am, this white writer who has a book with Ktunaxa characters. And in 4 years ago, nobody might have questioned that. But in 2017, we're more aware of cultural appropriation and power politics and writing from a privileged position. And I knew it wasn't okay for me to just publish this book as it was. So, but I was very nervous because I don't know, like, I didn't even know, didn't know who to approach or how to ask them, or if they would be mad at me or mean to me or hostile, or I didn't know.
Right.
So I started, my cousin, Frank Bush, is a Cree writer, and he's a novelist. And so I asked him to read it and give me some advice, and he did, and I made changes, and I thought maybe that would be good enough. And he's like, well, no, it's not good enough. I'm Cree, I'm not Tanaha. Now you have to go and ask their permission. So I cold called them. I just called Natasha Burgoyne, who was at that time the cultural liaison. And I said, I've written this book. There's Tanaha characters. I want to know if it's okay. And so I hired her. And we did 3 readings together, back and forth passes. And I made several changes. That's one of the things people say, is that if you're going to do a cultural consultation like that, you have to be willing to make changes. It can't just be lip service. You can't say, oh, here, just can you okay this? If I'm going to someone and saying, is this okay? If they say, well, no, you have to change this and that and the other thing, then I have to. And I made really big changes.
Right. I find it interesting that you actually said that, you know, you got to a point where you weren't sure where to go. And if I was to talk to some of your students and in some of your writing courses, they would be sort of maybe flabbergasted with that statement, because they look to you as, you know, just that natural writer. So I guess that sort of explains something that all writers face. Can you just talk about that a little bit? How do you get past that, you know, maybe I'm not going to call it writer's block, but that sort of, can I move the story forward?
And I have that with every book. I feel like I need to learn how to write every book, and I keep thinking it's going to get easier, and it doesn't. And if anything, it gets harder because I'm holding myself to higher standards. But I think for me, I do call it writer's block, and I think writer's block is a kind of perfectionism, right? If you have this idea in your head of a story, and it's so perfect in your head, right? And people come and say, oh, I have this idea for a novel. I couldn't care less about your idea for a novel, because an idea is nothing, it's air, right? But when you get it from your head to the page, it's not going to be this beautiful thing. It's going to be a big disastrous mess. And so for me, to get over writer's block is just making myself write every day. And when I'm in a project, I make myself put my pen to the paper every day, and it doesn't always come alive. Like I had, as I said, when I got to that conference in Regina, I had been for months struggling at this thing that wasn't coming to life. But I found trusting the process, just trusting that it always has eventually come to life if I put the time in, and that, you know, I might not use everything that I write. But you know, I like to use athletic analogies, but athletes, not every time they show up is a competition. There's lots of times that they're just putting hours in the pool, going back and forth, and it's practice. And maybe some of those pages are just practice, or they're getting you where you need to go. But I think it's really important to show up at the page every day and trust in the process. And just I remind myself that it's always worked out eventually, but definitely I do get writer's block.
So do you share that with your students?
Yep.
Yeah. What's a reaction that you have to write every day?
I think they're okay. I think they react okay to that. Like the people like good solid advice. Like, okay, I can do that. I can write every day. But I've had students when they say they're struggling and it's not going well and they're stressed out. I sometimes say, oh, I know, I'm in the same boat. And they're like, oh, sorry to hear that. I'm like, no, I'm always in that boat. That's what it feels like to write. And if you don't like that part, you might want to reconsider.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, we need to wrap this up, Angie. Congratulations on the new book. Thanks for taking the time to be our guest today on Talking Kootenay Books.
Thanks for having me.
My name is Keith Powell, and this has been Talking Kootenay Books. Welcome. This is Talking Kootenay Books. I'm Keith Powell, and our guest today is Bob Wakulich. Bob, it's great to have you here. I know you've got a lot of experience when it comes to writing. You're involved in the theatrical community in Cranbrook as well. Recently published some books online and also have a hard copy. I first met you over at Beers and Books, and and I really enjoyed your reading. Your writing has a bit of an edge to it, but also a fair bit of humor in it as well.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, the first time I went to university back in the 70s, they didn't have creative writing programs at universities yet. I was editing the campus newspaper, and after I got my degree from Lakehead in Thunder Bay, I spent a few years just working on my writing by myself at home. And then I got an opportunity to go to the Banff Centre to take the summer writing workshop, and that's when W.O. Mitchell was still running it. So he had this process for writing called freefall, where you just sit down and type whatever's in your mind, and you worry about sorting it out later, which was actually a very good way to generate material. And it's still being, like, variations of that are still being used by a lot of people. It's mostly just to keep you writing, right? The idea that you need to write is okay, but the fact that you structure yourself kind of, and you start editing yourself as you write gets to be a real impediment to getting anything done. So after that, I've done journalism and written nonfiction and did a number of jobs in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s, I decided to go back to school because I found out that people would be willing to hire me to teach, but I didn't have the credential. So I went back and got another bachelor's degree in fine arts at UVic, University of Victoria, and then an MFA at UBC. Again, that was kind of an interesting time because George McWhorter was in the department there at that time, and he was really big on what he called experimental fiction, which was essentially trying to put unusual formats of writing, like not sticking to the normal sort of genres, but trying to mix them together. Right. So I had a lot of fun with that, and it was an interesting crowd back then. That particular group of people that went through the master's program, a lot of them ended up getting published and moving on and doing all kinds of other things. Oh, and I managed to get a job teaching after that, so it was okay.
So let's talk about your job teaching. You were at the College of the Rockies. What did you say? 14 years.
14 years, yeah.
So what was your responsibility there?
Well, with the college, their main concern was making sure they had their prerequisites to get into the program. So I spent a lot of time teaching composition. And studying the masters, right, kind of thing, doing poetry and the survey courses, first and second year survey courses, which kind of was one of the reasons I decided to do this chapbook, because I'd read the material so many times. I was almost channeling these guys. So also I did fine arts. I did teach an acting class, taught some film studies classes. These are all things that I had taken while I was going back to school in the 90s.
I see. So you're really involved in the creative process. How many students would typically be in a class? How many would you say that you would have influenced over the course of your career there?
Well, it's kind of funny because some of the composition students actually I had didn't even take creative writing from me and still ended up, getting into creative writing, which was kind of nice. I think the influence has to be is when you're dealing with students writing is that you have to convince them that what they want to write about is worth writing about, because a lot of the times they're saying, well, I like to write but nobody wants to read what I'm talking about, and they can't see themselves as novelists or once you start worrying about genres, then you kind of tie yourself up in knots. If you have something you want to write it down. Leave it alone for a couple of days, have a look at it, see if it still entertains you, and if it doesn't, then move on to something else. If it does, work on it and see if it'll turn into something for you.
So you have a few books online, Smash Words and so forth.
Yeah.
Talk about that process. What's that all about?
Well, part of the problem with one of the things I did notice when I went back to school in the 90s was. There were I had an opportunity to meet a lot of agents, and at that time it was kind of a youth movement. So once a lot of these agents found out I was over 40, that was the end of the conversation. But I did talk to some people who mentioned the fact that they had, like a few people I know who've gotten books published by big publishers, actually published on Smashwords and got picked up from there. So I mean, it's much the same as submitting a manuscript to a publisher. I mean, if it tweaks someone's interest, it may end up getting picked up. Right. So I had gone the route, and sent these manuscripts out for years and years. A couple of times they were accepted for publication, and then the publishers went under before they could publish it. So I was, rather than think I was cursed, I just kept, plodding away. And then The Smashwords setup now is actually quite beneficial, just in terms of promoting books, and it's a good way. It's just a good way to see, to get some feedback from people about things you could tweak the thing with. That's the nice thing about Smashwords too. You can actually tweak the manuscripts if you decide that if you get enough feedback on it. So
it's almost an interactive experience.
Yeah, and it's one of the advantages of the internet. I'm not saying some people, it takes a while, in terms of posting it and getting feedback, but I have had some interesting comments from people who've either downloaded samples or downloaded the actual books. Right? So,
talking about your chat book, let's explore that. When did that come out, and what was the sort of genesis behind that?
Well, it was published in spring of this year, 2017. It was just sort of, there was an announcement for a small publisher in Ontario was having a chapbook contest. Chapbooks, so people understand, it's just essentially a small book, a small collection of either poems or stories. It's usually less than 48 pages. It's meant more to promote the writer as well as the contents. Quite often a chapbook will have some kind of thematic. It'll be a suite of poems or a series of short stories or something like that. So I, just before Christmas, let's say about October, November last year, I started thinking about writing in the guise of other authors, right? The idea, because I've done this before. I've done satires where I've written in the guise, written in the style of Leonard Cohen, or I wrote a not a nonfiction piece. I guess you just call it a humor piece, where I had 20 Canadian authors rewriting "The Rain in Spain Falls Mainly on the Plain" in their own way. So this was kind of a similar thing where I put together 17 poems written by various. They had to be deceased authors this time. It didn't have, So what would Allen Ginsberg think of cable service? What would Al Purdy think of the high-end restaurants? That kind of stuff, right?
Do you feel comfortable sharing one with us, or?
Sure.
Okay.
If you want, yeah.
Just put you on the spot here.
Yeah, that's okay. Let's see. Well, the other thing about doing this is you have to, when you're writing about contemporary issues using classic, the styles of dead authors, you have to sort of update their view on the world, and it's kind of funny because I think all writers borrow from other writers.
Sure.
It's just when you're doing this, you're being very obvious about
Right.
it. So it's like, this is William Carlos Williams analyzes reality television. With the ruthless indifference of bored executioners, we are drawn to these well-planned accidents invading our plasma displays between endless come-ons from surgically altered ambulance chasers, cheerful purveyors of theoretical food, and wonder drug hucksters. We know reality is something else, but concede that in our waning exposure to its charms, tedious suburban housewives, trust fund divas, spray tan control freaks, overcompetitive dandies, and other suppliers of repugnant delights will have to suffice.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. Okay.
So obviously you were able to get the chat book out. Any other plans for another publication?
Yeah, I put out one collection of columns I'd written for the Townsman, for the local paper here, humor columns. I've still got another collection that I'm putting together that's going to be released on Smashwords as well. Okay. And I've got a novel in progress, but my trouble with my novels is they usually take anywhere from 15 to 20 years to write. The first one I actually managed to get done took me over 15 years. So this is the third attempt, or third novel. Okay. So I guess I'm not going to be a Stephen King prolific writer, but I guess it's just the style I work in. It just and I think some people get scared off from writing because they think they have to crank something out.
And I wanted to ask you about that because you influenced a lot of young writers in your teaching and your career, undoubtedly. You've learned from some of the best if you've had W.O. Mitchell as an instructor.
Yeah.
What advice do you pass on to aspiring writers?
This is hard to do when you're younger, but be patient. and also don't kick yourself too much. Like you basically, I think every day you write, you learn something that you didn't know the day before, and you can apply it to what you've already written. One of the worst things I think about writing is learning how to edit yourself. And if you're patient about that, and you're not trying to, you're not trying to treat yourself like you're some kind of idiot, like you, because that's the problem, right? Some days you look at your writing and you think, what was I thinking, right? And then 2 weeks later, you look at the same material and realize, all I have to do is this, and it's great. So it's a hunt. It's like a treasure hunt. It's a search, except it's all your material, right? So that would probably be the best idea. Don't just be patient.
Good advice. Bob, thanks for taking the time to be a guest on our show today.
Okay, thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And this has been Talking Kootenay Books. I'm Keith Powell.